In this video, we're going to be talking about how a cell maintains homeostasis, so stays in a stable, healthy environment, while molecules are being transported across the cell membrane. So to start with cellular homeostasis, so when we're looking at this right here, the tendency of a cell to maintain a constant and healthy environment is homeostasis. So it's just this healthy, stable environment, all right? So unicellular organisms grow, respond to the environment, they transform energy, and they reproduce, and they do all these things to help them maintain homeostasis. Cells in multicellular organisms, those becomes very specialized for specific jobs, and they communicate with one another to maintain homeostasis. So there's a multiple set of ways that cells can maintain this healthy and stable environment known as homeostasis. So we're going to look at two types. We're going to look at passive and active transport. So passive transport has three different types of molecular transport that goes across the membrane, which is diffusion, facilitated diffusion, and osmosis. So to start off with, let's talk a little bit about passive transport. So the cell membrane is part of the cell that decides what can enter and what can exit the cell. So this is something we've talked about before when we've talked about cell organelles, is that cell membrane, all right? This decides, it's like a security guard. It decides what can go in and what can go out of the cell. So when molecules move from one side of the cell to the other side without energy, that's the key right there. So there's no energy required to help molecules move from one side of the cell membrane to the other. This is what we call passive transport, and there's those three types. First type we're going to look at is diffusion. So we're looking at diffusion. This is the process by which a solute, so solutes are particles that are dissolved in a liquid, move from an area of higher concentration to an area of low concentration across the cell membrane until they try to reach equal amounts, which is known as equilibrium. So looking at the picture here, step one, as you can see, right when you're looking at the picture, you can see that right out here on the outside of the cell membrane, outside of the cell, you have only two particles, while in the inside, you have way more than that, right? So you have a much higher concentration inside versus outside. There's a higher amount. So what ends up happening is some of the particles from inside, because that's where you have that higher concentration, move to the outside, all right? So they do this because they're trying to balance out. They're trying to reach equilibrium or an equal amount on both sides until finally you do have that stable environment where you have an equal amount of particles on both sides. So one thing we can write on the word diffusion to kind of help us remember this right here is that when particles go from a high to a low area of concentration, that is diffusion, all right? And again, diffusion is a type of passive transport, meaning it does not use any sort of energy. Let's look at facilitated diffusion. So facilitated diffusion, we're still talking about the exact same thing here with facilitated diffusion. The only difference here is that because some of the particles are either larger or they're charged, okay, so they're ions, all right, positively or negatively charged, they have to pass through the cell membrane with the help, which is facilitation, so you're kind of helping, you're assisting with the use of a protein. So still no energy is used here, but a protein is still needed to kind of help these molecules pass through the cell membrane. So when we're looking at the picture down here, we're seeing, for example, here we have a chlorine ion, all right, it's negatively charged. So the chlorine ion right here, what it does, it's because it's charged, it can't just pass through the cell membrane the way we saw in diffusion. So it uses this protein right here, and that protein allows it to kind of move and maneuver its way through to the other side of the cell when it's doing this molecular transport right here. So to help us remember facilitated diffusion a little bit, with the L of facilitated, we can put help, and then with the P, we're going to write protein. So facilitated diffusion is the passage of these molecules with the help of a protein. Now, the last type of passive transport we're going to look at is something known as osmosis. So when we're looking at osmosis, osmosis is specifically, it's still diffusion, but it's a diffusion of water, all right? So it's through a selectively permeable membrane. So permeable means to have permission to pass through, all right? Things can go through, but it's selectively because, again, the membrane chooses what can and cannot. So this is specifically diffusion with water. So when you're looking at the picture right over here, all we're seeing here are H2O, which are water molecules. And so this is osmosis going in and out of the cell, trying to reach that state of equilibrium. So what I like to do with the word osmosis, I like to write H2 on top of the O like that, so it's H2O. So this helps you remember that osmosis is specifically for water molecules. All right, so now we're going to look at the cell in three different states. So when a cell is considered isotonic, all right, This means that they have equal amounts of those solids, so those dissolved particles that we've been looking at. There's equal amounts inside and outside the cell. All right. So this is when it's actually in that healthy, stable environment. So for this one, with the word isotonic, we're going to write the word stable. So when a cell is already stable, it's considered to be isotonic. So with this one, things will be moving in and out of the cell just constantly, just to keep making sure that they're maintaining that constant state of equilibrium. A cell that is considered to be hypertonic, all right, so let's look at this one right here. So when we're looking at something that's hypertonic, that means that they have a higher amount of solutes outside the cell, all right? So if there's a higher percentage of solutes outside the cell and they're dissolved in water, that means the percentage of water in this entire solution is less because you just have a higher number of solutes. So because you have less water out there, we actually need more water to move out of the cell. And that's what you see happening right here. More water is moving out of the cell. So to help us remember what's going on here with hypertonic, we're going to write the word less like this. So when a cell is in a hypertonic solution, we are expecting water to move out. It wants less water, so water is going to be moving out of the cell. Let's look at a hypotonic cell. So cells are considered hypotonic when they have lower amounts of solutes outside of the cell. So again, solutes are dissolved in water. It's the whole thing is a solution. So when you have less solute, that means that in the solution there's a higher percentage of water that you have there. So in this case, because you have more water outside and you want to reach the state of equilibrium, we want water to move into the cell. So that's what you see right here. H2O is moving in because there's more water outside right now. So in this case, when it's a hypertonic solution, we're going to write more. So this lets you remember that when a cell's in a hypotonic solution, it wants more water coming in. So water is going to be entering the cell. All right, so now let's take a look at active transport. All right, so this one we have protein pumps, and then when there's bulk transport, so really, really big things, we have two processes. One is known as endocytosis and the other is exocytosis. All right, so to look at active transport, with active transport, this is the same thing that you saw with the other types, where there's still things moving in and out of the cell, but this time energy is required. All right, so remember ATP, we've talked about that before, adenosine triphosphate, that's energy with the cells. So in this case, when there's this ATP necessary, this energy is necessary, this is now active transport. All right, so let's start off by looking at a protein pump. All right, so small things can be carried across the cell membrane using proteins that act like pumps. So even though they're smaller things, if for whatever reason they require some energy to move across the membrane, this is when they're going to use these protein pumps. All right, so protein pumps are going to pass things such as calcium, potassium, and sodium. So when we're looking at the picture, we can see that we have the cell membrane right here, all right? And here we have a protein pump that has now positioned itself on the cell membrane. So it allows the molecule right here, this little red circle, it allows it to go in, and it kind of pushes it through. So think of kind of like a toothpaste bottle when you're kind of squeezing it to push the toothpaste out. It's kind of like that. So it pushes it through, and then step 2 over here kind of opens up on the other side, and then the molecule is able to exit or enter the cell, whatever it's doing, with the use of this protein pump. So now let's look at bulk transport. This is also part of active, meaning there's still energy required here. So bulk transport is needed when large, like really large molecules and clumps of molecules are needed to pass across the cell membrane, either into or out of the cell. So we have endo and exocytosis. So these are large molecules having to pass through with the use of energy. All right, let's look at endocytosis. So when we're seeing endocytosis, endocytosis occurs when a cell takes in materials by creating a pocket in the cell membrane. The pocket then breaks off and makes a vesicle, which is like a pouch, or what I put right here, if you look in the picture, I called it kind of like a vehicle because it's kind of transporting it in just the way a vehicle transports things. So that's a vesicle right there. It's a little bubble, a little pouch that kind of gets created right there. So you see you have the cell membrane right here in the picture. So this right here would be the outside of the cell. This right here would be the inside of the cell. So what you see here is this really large molecule has to enter here, all right, by creating that pocket. And once it's, fully in there, then it breaks off like this into a little pouch known as that vesicle. So for endocytosis, what I like to write enter like this. So this helps you remember that when you have endocytosis, things are entering the cell. Now finally, let's look at the last type of active transport, the last type of bulk active transport that requires energy. It's known as exocytosis. So this is the opposite of endocytosis. So when we're looking at exocytosis, this occurs when a cell pushes out materials already in a vesicle or a little tiny vacuole. So the vacuole's membrane merges with the cell membrane, and then the particles get released. So when you're looking at it, this one right here, this is the inside of the cell, and this right here is the outside of the cell. So in this case right here, inside the cell, you have this large molecule that was already put into a vesicle, those pouches that we just talked about, and as it moves towards the cell membrane, it merges with the cell membrane, as you can see happening right here. It merges with the cell membrane, and then right there, it kind of opens up. I know you can't really see it, but it would open up right here in this little section right here, and then that molecule is able to be pushed out, all right? So this is exocytosis. So what I write here is the word exit to help you remember that when exocytosis is occurring, that means that molecules are exiting the cell.